Welcome, everyone. My name is Roxanne, and I'm a grad global impact intern at International House. The mission of International House is to enable students and scholars from around the world to live and learn together in a diverse community that builds lifelong qualities of leadership, respect, and friendship. Founded in 1932 by John D. Rockefeller Jr., International House of Chicago is today one of 20 members of the International House's worldwide network. In addition to supporting the graduate student community through our Graduate Commons program, International House also serves the greater Chicago community as a cultural and intellectual center for a wide array of programs. Close to 100 public programs are held each year at International House through the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series, and during autumn quarter, we're providing virtual, in-person, and hybrid programming. You can learn more about the different types of events at ihouse.uchicago.edu. The Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series includes outreach programs with Chicago area international organizations, collaborations with foreign consulates, music and cultural performances, and discussions and debates led by distinguished guest speakers, including those for today's program that we are so pleased to co-sponsor with Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Margaret D. Jacobs is a professor of history and director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her previous books include White Mother to a Dark Race, Settler Colonialism, Maternalism, and the Removal of Indigenous Children in the American West and Australia, 1880, and to 1940. After 100 Winters confronts the harsh truth that the United States was founded on the violent dispossession of Indigenous people and asks what reconciliation might mean in light of this haunted history. In this timely and urgent book, settler historian Margaret Jacobs tells the stories of the individuals and the communities who are working together to heal historical wounds and reveals how much we have to gain from learning our history instead of denying it. Drawing on dozens of interviews, After 100 Winters reveals how Indigenous people and settlers in America today, despite their troubled history, are finding unexpected gifts in reconciliation. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, so please submit those via the Q&A function. And don't forget, you can purchase After 100 Winters from Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Now, please welcome Margaret Jacobs.
So I want to introduce Rosalyn LaPier. Rosalyn is in conversation with me this evening, and Rosalyn is a professor of environmental studies. Do I have that right, Roz? At University of Montana in Missoula. And she, among other things, she's really interested in ethnobotany and her work, especially on Blackfeet ethnobotany, and she's an award-winning author. I'm forgetting the name of your book at the moment, Roz, but maybe you can add to my introduction.
So thank you so much. So I've written 2 books. One is Invisible Reality, Storytellers, Story Takers, and the Supernatural World of the Blackfeet. And I also co-wrote a book on Indigenous activism in urban areas called City Indian, Native American Activism in Chicago. So thank you.
Yeah, so it's exciting to be here tonight at a bookstore in Chicago, and that was in particular why I wanted to invite Roz to be in conversation, because I know of her long history there and working in that and research on that area. I thought I'd begin just by reading a little bit of the first part of the book, and then Roz and I will have a kind of conversation about that. So you need to know a little bit before I can read this little section. So the book opens at a family farm owned by 2 white settlers in Neely, Nebraska, which is in the central part of the state. The 2 white settlers are named Art and Helen Tanderup, and they're in their 60s. They became accidental political activists when the Keystone XL company decided to run the pipeline through their land. And they opposed that vociferously, and they allied with a number of the Native nations that are in the area, including the Ponca people, which the Ponca people are divided into a northern and southern Ponca tribe. So they allied with these tribes, and they actually formed very deep friendships, and they started holding what they call a spirit camp, which is where they actually erected a teepee on their farm. And in November, they started meeting in the teepee, sharing meals, sharing stories, sharing prayers, and then also strategizing politically. And one of the Ponca people they became closest to is a man named Mikasi Horinik. So I think that's enough info for you to get to understand where I'm going to come from in this brief reading. On one of those tranquil nights in the spirit camp teepee, Mikasi told the Tandarups that in the mid-1870s, the US government decided to forcibly move his tiny tribe, the Poncas, to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Most of the tribal members refused to go. The government inspector brought 60 members of the cavalry to force the Poncas to move. As Chief White Eagle described it, the soldiers got on their horses, went to all the houses, broke open our doors, took our household utensils, put them in their wagons, and pointing their bayonets at our people, ordered them to move. In the teepee, as the fire crackled and bathed each person in an amber light, Mikasi told the Tandarups the story of what happened on the Ponca's Trail of Tears. Their ancestors had trudged over this very spot 136 years earlier. Storms pummeled them almost every day of their 600-mile journey. Many died on the long walk, including an 18-month-old child, White Buffalo Girl, who was buried nearby in Neely. When they finally arrived in Indian Territory after 55 days, the government had not made any provisions for their new home. The Poncas, who had been living in wooden frame houses in Nebraska, now had to huddle in makeshift tents. They had arrived too late to plant crops, so they faced starvation. About a quarter of the tribe succumbed to malaria and other diseases. What happened to the Poncas also happened to hundreds of other indigenous groups in every territory and state of the United States. We could call what happened something benign, something euphemistic, and we often do. We could label it westward expansion, winning of the West, pioneering, homesteading. Even in 2019, a New York Times writer dubbed it opening the West. But what happened to the Poncas and other American Indian nations was theft. It can be deeply uncomfortable for many settlers to face the illegitimate foundations upon which our settlement is based. It's hard to acknowledge that we settlers, I'm a settler, are trespassers on native land. We've been taught through our formal education and countless informal messages to believe that we settlers are entitled to be here. It can unsettle us, literally, to realize that our settler histories of triumph are inextricably intertwined with indigenous histories of theft. American Indian people like Mikasi want settlers like the Tandarups to know their histories, but they also get weary of telling their tales of misery and despair. So it was that Mikasi and other Poncas shared their dreams for the future in the spirit camp teepee. Mikasi told the Tandarups, "Our people lost the sacred corn when we were removed to Oklahoma, and it would be great to bring that corn back to its homeland. Would you mind if we plant it here?" Without hesitation, Art said he wouldn't mind at all. So ever since then, the Poncas have been converging on the Tandarups' family farm twice a year, first in the early summer to plant and then in the fall to harvest their corn. This 5th year of Ponca corn planting at the Tandarup farm is special. Before the planting begins, a ceremony is held. Today, in June of 2018, Art and Helen Tandarup are signing a deed that returns the Ponca's 10-acre corn plot to them. It is not often that settlers learn about the specific piece of land they occupy, of how Indigenous people were dispossessed and displaced from it. It is rare, too, that Indigenous people have the opportunity to meet and share their history with the descendants of the settlers who displaced them. The Tandraps came to know the truth of the place where they had settled. The Poncas gently offered this truth to them as a kind of gift. It is even more unusual for settlers to take some responsibility for this truth, and rarer still to take action to make amends for it. The Tandraps are uncommon settlers indeed. I don't share this story to lionize the Tandraps as white saviors who took pity on the Poncas and gave them a small donation of land. I'm relating what the Tandraps did because they show us what can happen when settlers and Indigenous people face their painful truths together, plant new seeds of friendship, uncover paths to reconciliation and redress, and imagine new futures. They show us other possibilities of how we can hold unsettling knowledge within us and learn to live together on haunted land. So that's the first little excerpt I wanted to read, and would love to hear your thoughts, Roz, or questions, whatever you want to say.
So first of all, I mean, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this evening's discussion, and to really share a discussion about a really important book. I think I want to begin by first saying, you know, I had the privilege to be able to read this book in the last month, and I really did enjoy it. It was enjoy it. I should say that enjoy it in air quotes. I think it really is an excellent book that people should get and read. Oftentimes, we think about these subjects, but don't take that deep dive into our own history in the United States. And I think that you do an excellent job in the book of kind of splitting the book between taking that deep dive into our history that in the book you called our founding crimes as in the United States, and then in the second half of the book, talking about sort of how to move forward from that and how communities can work towards reconciliation, how that's been done in other places around the world. And so we do have some models, we do have some examples from other places that have been trying to work through this story of violence, story of colonization, but also this story of reconciliation. And so one of the things I'd like to discuss is, since we're both women historians, is how do you think this story is told differently by women? I think that we know this from being scholars and being writers, that, you know, the majority of what is written and published out there is written by men and published by so having that different voice to tell the story, I think is important. And so I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts about how you, as a woman historian or woman writer, tells this story, maybe with a different lens.
Wow, what a question. So I come at the book, even though it's not overt in the book, as a feminist scholar. And many of my other works have been more explicitly about women, especially white women. And what I guess if you were to encapsulate what I've written in the past, it's about white women behaving badly toward Native women. So like one of the last books I wrote was about white women who worked in the Indian boarding schools and or worked to promote the boarding school education for Native children, and really undermined Native women and Native families in doing that. I guess I come at it partly from a kind of a feminist praxis of writing, because I think it's really important that we writers don't take this very aloof, omnipotent view, and act like we're not part of the story. I think it's really important as a white settler woman to interrogate my place in this story and think about how, through no fault of my own, through no intention of my own, I'm nevertheless complicit in this this dispossession of Native people, and I'm a beneficiary of it, like all settlers are. And that I think it's really important to personally dig deep to unravel my own place and figure out how I am going to respond to this. Not that I'm just going to write about it, but how am I going to respond to this and live my life differently as a result of this knowledge.
Yeah, and I think it is different when you're a woman writer, to look at this same information and these same stories and interpret it in a new light. And I think that you do that really nicely, especially at the beginning of the book when you talk about, again, this idea of founding crimes. So not thinking about our history in the United States necessarily as the story of triumph and of overcoming, but actually a story of dispossession. And maybe if you can share a little bit more with folks about why do you think that that's important, that we have, again, that sort of different interpretation of our history here in the United States, that kind of early 19th century history?
Well, I think it's important. One of the points I've always worked on, I think it's another expression of the way that this is a feminist or that might be written differently. I've always really thought that colonialism has happened in a very intimate way. It has really affected families. It has affected people at their very bodies. It's not something that's far away. It's not some big geopolitical thing. So I think it's really important that we move away from these mythologies that have guided us or not guided us, that have really taken us down the totally wrong path. All these mythologies about winning the West, all these mythologies about, this triumphant national progress, this narrative of national progress that has really done a disservice to Indigenous people's histories and Indigenous people's histories of theft and stealing, not just land, but children and resources and culture and even ancestral remains. I mean, there's been so much stealing, even and identities, even, right? We read a lot about people who are pretending to be Indian. So there's so much theft. And I just think it's really important, if we're ever going to create what I hope we're going to create, this very pluralistic, democratic society where there's a lot of mutual respect and mutual dignity for people. I don't feel like we can create a society like that until we really face up to this history and really accept or acknowledge that it was a history based on crime, and crime against Indigenous people is the very first crime, and slavery, of course, as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like I should break in for a commercial interruption here, which is, one, I really do encourage people to, buy this book, but also I encourage people to read this book because I do think it is important. But one of the things I wanted to ask about is, the first half of the book is very difficult to read. It is a difficult history. It's a difficult story. You are telling true stories. And they are often stories that even in today in modern America that people do not want to hear. And so it's something that what are your, I guess, suggestions to, especially to non-Indigenous audiences about how, because for Indigenous people, this is our story, right? We know these, as you just mentioned, we know these stories very intimately, whereas non-Indigenous people don't know them as intimately, and they are sort of these distant narratives that they may have heard of or may not have. But as I mentioned, it is difficult history, difficult truths that are being told. And so I guess what are your suggestions for non-Indigenous readers in particular as they are getting through kind of that first half of the story before they get to the reconciliation and sort of, some really great suggestions for how to change that American story?
Yeah, you're right, Roz, that the first part of the book, I really see in my mind, I'm thinking the first part of the book is about truth and the second part is about reconciliation. And I ended up really talking about searching for the truth in my own personal history. The two places I've lived the longest in my life are Colorado, where I grew up, and Nebraska. So I end up really focusing on those two places. In part, I do that to encourage other settlers to investigate the places where they live or have lived the longest, so that it's something personal for everybody. And yes, it is really hard to read that. It's hard to come to grips with it, but I really feel it very strongly that it's not meant to guilt trip people. It's meant to, I feel like we have to become grown-ups. In order to become grown-ups in our society, we need to know the history of the places where we live, and we need to understand that what we settlers have often been told is like great progress has come at the expense of other people. And so when we realize that, I just think it's so important that we then take the next step, which is the second half of the book, which is about how do we be accountable for that? How do we be responsible? And I think it's just really important. We've got to learn the truths of these places where we've settled. And it is harsh. It's hard to read, but I only can imagine just how much harder that is for a Native person to read this, or to have experienced it, or to have this family lore in your community. And if Native people can handle it, why can't we settlers? Why can't we also, grow up and face this history?
Yeah, and I think the second half of your book is different. I'm not going to say it's like it's a different story is being told, which is the 21st century story, right? So we move sort of from the history of the United States of America to sort of what is happening in the 21st century, and like especially what's happening internationally. And you give some really great examples from places such as Australia and Canada of what they're trying to do. So maybe can you share a little bit about sort of internationally, what are other countries how are they trying to address that same sort of history of, again, of colonization and violence, and kind of the violent, removal of Indigenous people or Indigenous children from their families? How are they trying to address those same kind of issues that we quite haven't gotten there yet in the United States?
Exactly. And so, yeah, the first part of the book, after documenting what happened in the founding of Colorado and the massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek, and then there's a big section on the Ponca, and then how they were exiled and what that meant to them. And then there's a big section on how a major leader of the Ponca, Standing Bear, went on a tour in 1879 on the East Coast, and he mobilized a big, huge group of white settlers, many of whom had been abolitionists, to take up what they called the Indian problem. I always think it should have been called the settler problem, But anyway, and
let me just jump in. I mean, I think that that story of Standing Bear, and that's such a great story of really resilience and what we would call now activism on his part.
Yes.
Of really trying to make his voice be heard, to try to work within the system that he was in at that time, work within the system to, again, using modern day terms, like finding those allies that would work with him to make his voice heard and to change, create change. And I think that is a really great story that you tell in that section of the book of just his resilience and what an amazing person that he really was.
Absolutely. As well as Suzette LaFlèche, who was his Omaha interpreter, who also spoke Ponca. And both Suzette and Standing Bear, their primary aspiration was to get land back, hashtag land back for the Poncas. And this is in the 1880s. This is right after they'd been removed. So they mobilize all these white people who call themselves Friends of the Indian. And for a very brief time, they actually supported the Poncas and other tribes in trying to get back their land. But eventually they turned to what they thought was a better solution, which turned out to be allotment of Indian land and Indian boarding schools. Now, I've told you that long history to try to get into the second part of the book, because Indian boarding schools really involved the removal of Indigenous children. Up to 80% of all Indigenous children from 1880 to 1940 went to these schools. And they were an assault on Native communities, and they were incredibly damaging to families. And we're still living with the after effects of those, I would say. But these were strategies that other settler colonial nations followed as well. Australia was removing children, Aboriginal children. Canada was taking Indigenous children to the residential schools. So this was something that happened in many different British settler colonies. And so when you get to thinking about late 20th and early 21st century reconciliation efforts in Australia and Canada, they're all about this removal of Indigenous children. So Australia had a Stolen Generations inquiry, and they made reparations to what they call the Stolen Generations. They the Prime Minister made an apology to them. In Canada, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 6 years that was about the Indian residential schools. And many of you may know too that more recently, just last summer, Native nations finally had their long-standing experiences confirmed by scientific ground penetrating radar that there were mass graves at the Indian residential schools. And that has led somewhat to a little bit more consciousness about our Indian boarding schools in the US. And Canada, like Australia, the Prime Minister apologized to the nation. This TRC, as I call it, took testimony from thousands of Indigenous people about what they'd experienced. Thousands of Indigenous people also gained reparations for the harms that they had experienced in the residential schools. And then there's been some other efforts at providing funding for services within Native communities for Native people to come up with their own services, healing services. There's commemorations. So yes, those nations have all been doing that. And when I first started this book, I kind of thought, well, I'm just going to tell the story of what's happening in these other nations and encourage the United States to do the same thing. But it didn't turn out that way because, of course, I learned so much about critiques of what was happening in Australia and Canada, especially by Indigenous scholars and critics and activists who have been really unsatisfied by these efforts. And I really wanted to dig deep to figure out, well, why was it unsatisfying? And ultimately, one of the things, you'll have to read the book, but I should leave you in suspense. But one of the issues was that these nations weren't dealing with the foundational crimes of land dispossession. So that to me is a cautionary tale. And as we move forward in the United States to try to address some of these issues, it, much as I care so deeply about the issue of Indigenous child removal, I think we also have to connect it constantly to land dispossession.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important point that that you do discuss and bring kind of to the surface, and that whole idea of kind of the founding crimes, but then dispossession. I mean, one of the things that you don't use this phrase, but it's a phrase that's often used in environmentalism, is slow violence, right? And that there is this story of slow violence that occurs over time with this history that brings us to the present. And because it's been so incremental over time, we sometimes don't see it until it's the accumulative effect of kind of these multiple issues. And I think one of the things that the book does a great job of, or you do a great job of, is telling this cumulative effect of all of these multiple stories and how they impact communities, and how in the reconciliation process, when we do look at what has happened internationally, again, part of what they try to do sometimes is fix this one little piece and fix this other little piece and fix this other little piece as separate issues, not recognizing that those pieces are part of this history of slow violence that has happened over time, and that they have, they sort of add up to a larger issue. But I think that one of the things from your reading at the very beginning points out is that when Indigenous people are leading sort of that effort for reconciliation, oftentimes they are trying to address some very sort of intimate issues. And a good example is the one that you provided, which is, we want to grow our corn, right, in its historic place. And so, one of the things that has been erased, and you mention it kind of throughout the book, is that people are really interested in revitalizing some of those things, such as Indigenous food systems and traditional ecological knowledge, and the things that get misplaced when there's land loss. And land and land loss is connected so intimately to all of these other parts of Indigenous culture, that it is, even when tribes are trying to revitalize certain parts of their culture, if they don't have the land to do it with, then it's extremely difficult. So that's, again, one of the critiques of that reconciliation is like, hey, we need to talk about land too, because that's where all of this happens. And this is where our story is grounded. Sorry for the pun, but I get it grounded in. I guess one of my, before we get to the questions and answers, one of my questions also is, I also work in a university setting, and I work with lots of young people. And one of their questions always has to do with, the words that we use to describe what is happening. So even with the words such as truth and reconciliation, those words are fraught.
Absolutely.
One, they're in English, but can you say a little bit more about sort of just the terminology and words that you decided to use in this story that you're telling? Only because, again, this is something that young people, they will point these things out, right? They'll say, hey, why are you using this word instead of that word? And why are you saying this other So maybe you can say more about even just the word like reconciliation, um, and that sort of story of like its, I guess, contentious history itself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head that these terms are in English, and English is a colonial language. And all the terms that are available to me as an English speaker and writer are fraught, and I just have to do my best to use a term and explain why I'm using it and what it means in this context. And I chose to use the term truth and reconciliation, even though many Indigenous people don't like the term reconciliation. They will say, well, there was never a time when we were conciled, when we were conciliatory. So why would we use that term? I actually think historically there were times when Native people and non-Native settlers were conciliatory, and so that I'm historically maybe that's not so accurate, but I really get that point, and so I mean, I could have used other terms like transitional justice, restorative justice, redress, reparations. All of these are kind of in the mix in there, but I ended up using truth and reconciliation because I wanted to connect the possibilities for change with worldwide developments, because ever since World War II, we've had various truth and reconciliation efforts, starting with the Nuremberg trials, and moving up. The most famous example will be South Africa, and I think it's important to put what we're doing in the United States in context of those larger global movements, and also to see where do those larger global movements, where have they not worked? I mean, almost all of them, there's a lot of criticism of them, and they have not fulfilled what they meant to do, but they're a start. And what can we learn from those? And one of the things I learned is how important it is to indigenize the truth and reconciliation process. And I think Western conceptions of reconciliation are really often, they've got all these financial metaphors, like settling scores, paying debts, what does someone owe to somebody else? I think that they can really entrap us. And I think that's another reason Indigenous people are very wary about reconciliation. So to indigenize the concept of reconciliation, I think of as thinking more in terms of reciprocity and relationship building and gift exchanges. And that, really, when I started to see that happening on the ground at a grassroots level with, for example, the Poncas. And, I tell a lot of stories about the Pawnee people too, coming back to Nebraska, regaining land here and presence here. I saw that in action. I saw that different conception of reconciliation in action. And I always ask everybody I interview, and the book is built on a lot of interviews. I ask everybody, do you use this term reconciliation? Do you like this term? And I just get such a wide variety of answers. And just some people hate the term. Some people have come up with different terms. And, one woman I interviewed, a Pawnee woman named Electa Hare Redcorn, she talked about how she wants to find a Pawnee term to use for what this concept is. She prefers the term reciprocity, and she's going to keep working on finding the Pawnee term that she wants to use for it. And in Australia, many Aboriginal leaders have also, they like to use a word called makarata, which means coming together after a conflict. And I think maybe that's the way to go. Of course, we have how many languages, native languages? Over 300 still. And so that's a little bit challenging, but I just think that's really important. And language it's hard, and I'm glad people will ask me questions about that. I think it can generate a really productive conversation about why we use certain terms and how we're limited by them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, I really encourage folks to both get this book and read this book. It's a great kind of new history of the United States, I think, and interpretation of our story as a nation, but then also kind of our future as a nation, and where we should be heading, and kind of questions about how both settler society and Indigenous people can take the lead to bring a new kind of story of our American society. So I think that it's probably now time for questions and answers. So if there's questions from the audience, please feel free to, I think, ask a question in the chat box or the Q&A. And I think Roxanne might be jumping back in as well. So.
Yes, hello. So everyone feel free to put your question in the Q&A box. And I'll start with the question. I guess, like, what inspired you to write this? Like, kind of what hole were you trying to fill in other things that you had written that you realized that this kind of side to American history was missing?
Well, I think, a lot of motivations, anger, outrage at the injustices in our society, and feeling like, I'm a historian of the American West, like Roz is, and Roz and I have known each other from the Western History Association, where we meet every year, and Roz and I have both been working in this area for a long time. And I think it's really frustrating because we've been writing these, Western historians have been writing these really important histories that challenge these mythological narratives. But I feel like many of them aren't getting out into the popular world. And there's still this overwhelmingly popular mythology about the West. And so I wanted to write about, this book is not for an academic audience. I mean, I hope academics will read it, but it's mainly for a non-academic audience. And so I wanted to write something that anybody could read and would be accessible to anybody, but would help people to develop a different view of our history, for one thing. And the other motivation was having worked in the field of Indigenous child removal for about 2 decades and doing research on that, and following what's going on in Australia and Canada about trying to make some sort of redress for that, I just wanted to think about ways which the United States might someday do that too. And so I was hoping this book might be somewhat of a catalyst for, or contribute at least to conversations Native people have been having and lobbying the federal government. And we do see some great movement there with our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland of the Laguna Pueblo, calling for an investigation into the boarding schools. There's a new Truth and Healing Commission bill on the Indian boarding schools. And these are all coming from a wonderful organization called the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They've been working tirelessly on this. So I just wanted to contribute to these efforts. And I guess I got tired of just covering these histories and wanted to see what can we actually do to make amends for this? How can we be accountable?
Thank you. Yeah, we have something in the Q&A. Renee Moore asks, recently Lakeshore Drive was renamed to Du Sable Lakeshore. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Sorry, it's a longer name. To Du Sable Lakeshore Toho Nord, the first non-Indigenous settler who set up a trading post in what would become Chicago. DuSable's parents were African Haitian and French European. DuSable's wife was a member of the Algonquin Nation. As an African American woman, I questioned the justification of acknowledging the first non-native settler, which seemed to erase the Algonquin people. How can people of color shed US myths and practice of minimizing and erasing Indigenous people, doing so with all complexities considered benefits all? Thank you, Renee.
Yes, thank you, Renee. And I'd love to hear Roz's thoughts on this as well. I'll just give it a little quick answer and then I'd love to turn it over to Roz. But I use the term, again, talking about language, I use the term settler in the book, and I do that primarily because this is not just a history of white people versus Indigenous people. It's a history of all people who are not Indigenous to this land, who I call settlers, whether they're descendants or not. And it's a history of settlers and Indigenous people. And that includes even people who came here against their will, slaves or descendants of slaves who came here, and also suffered, incredible discrimination, incredible indignities. And yet we share this history of occupying stolen land. And so I think that's a really interesting point you bring out, because on the one hand, it seems like it's a very progressive thing to rename this Lakeshore Drive for an African-American settler. But on the other hand, at the same time, it then erases Indigenous histories there. So just your sensitivity to this is really admirable. And thank you for that. And I would love to hear what Roz has to say.
So yeah, I mean, that's a really great example of trying to address one particular issue, but bringing out the complexity of kind of that larger issue, which is still the issue of erasure. And so the issue of erasure of Indigenous people from our story, from our narrative of American history or even Chicago history, is still ever present. And so I think that it's good to be aware of that when it does occur, and to just remind people of, who were the people who lived here for thousands and thousands of years before this area was settled. But just FYI, it was settled before by Indigenous people, right? So when we talk about sort of the, first settlers, sometimes the first settlers are Indigenous people as well. But one of the things I was going to ask Margaret about this is, I think that there are great examples in this book throughout of Indigenous activists and activism. It's a word that we use kind of now, it's a contemporary word, but it does describe a lot of what Indigenous people have been doing since contact, in terms of the way that they interact with settler society. And I think there's some really great examples throughout this entire book, from beginning to end, of Indigenous activists and Indigenous individuals who are really, standing up and for themselves, for their families, their communities. And so not just to let people know, so not just sort of that the story of, you had even said it in the beginning, the introduction, of that Indigenous people often don't want to hear a never-ending narrative of sort of the things that have happened, but also want to hear this story of resilience and Indigenous activism.
Yes.
Looks like we don't have more questions in the chat yet, but I have another question, which is, so you mentioned the ways in which the situations with the Indigenous people in the United States can be comparable to in Canada and Australia, and some of the ways in which we could learn or unlearn from their approaches. But is there any way in which you think that the American story in this situation is fundamentally different, or something that is really unrecognizable in other contexts?
That's a great question. I do think the fact that, we don't have just one foundational crime in the United States. We have at least two, and the other major one is slavery. And Canada and Australia and many other nations that nevertheless dispossessed Indigenous people don't have that same history. And I do think that makes things enormously complicated in terms of so many people deserve justice in this country, not, Indigenous people, African Americans, refugees, immigrants. So many people have been hurt by the way that this country was founded and are still experiencing the legacies and the long-term consequences of that. So I do think that's one thing that sets us apart. But I don't think it means that we can't deal with these questions the same way or in some way just because we have so much. We still need to do that. And I started out this book thinking, gosh, we in the US, we're so far behind what's going on in other places. And at the national level, that's definitely true. But I've been so incredibly surprised and refreshed to find so much going on at the grassroots level. And I did not know about that. I mean, when I started this book, one of the things I decided to do was I thought, well, I want to do a lot of interviews with people. And in the past, when I do interviews, I just say, oh, I'm going to do this interview and then I'm going to print it out and I'm going to stick it in a folder and it's going to go in my closet or my basement, or it's going to go on a hard drive on my computer and nobody else will ever see this interview. But I thought, well, why? I want to make these available to people. So I decided I wanted to do a podcast. But then I thought, well, this is a podcast about Indigenous people and settlers engaging in reconciliation. And I don't want to do this podcast by myself. So I reached out to a local Lakota journalist here in Lincoln, Nebraska, named Kevin Aberesk. And Kevin and I started a project together called Reconciliation Rising. And so we've been doing a lot of interviews together for our podcast. And then we decided to make a film. We're making a film about return of land at these kind of micro levels, these grassroots levels. So, the story of the Poncas and the story of the Pawnees gaining back land. But we found these instances of this all over the nation. So at the grassroots level, there's really a lot going on in this country. There are people, settlers and Indigenous people working together to try to bring justice especially around land issues. And so I've come to feel like the United States is not so behind after all, because one of the weaknesses in the processes in Australia and Canada is that it hasn't engaged settlers as much as it might. And I mean, I think that's changing there too, but it's a positive thing that's going on in the US. And we never hear these stories though. They don't make the national news. And I think that's a shame, because I think what we showcase in the news and what we read every day really shapes our ideas of what is possible. So if we only ever see, people engaging in bad behavior, we will encourage more bad behavior, right? But if we learn about people who are doing really morally and ethically responsible things, I think it can help shape other people's ideas of what is possible and what they could do in their own lives. And so the book in one way is an attempt to encourage people to take those risks and, not only try to understand your own history, but then to take steps to make amends for it.
No, and as I mentioned, I think this is a really important book, but as Margaret mentioned, I mean, this is written for the general audience. Anybody could read this book, or anybody can listen to this book. So even though I said earlier that I read the book, actually I listened to the book. It's now a book on, I guess I'm too old. I always say a book on tape. It's not on tape anymore. It's an audio book now as well, and it is a great listen. So it's something that that you can listen to it chapter by chapter and really get a lot out of it and really learn something new about this story of the United States of America, but also about what Indigenous people are doing as well. So it is a great book. So thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Roz.
I think we are just about at time, but thank you both so much. It was a really interesting evening, and it was really pleasant having you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to talk with you, Roz.
Yep.
Thank you, Roxanne.